When a high school teacher stops to help a stranger after a car accident, he has no idea how that single act of kindness will change his life forever. What begins as a promise to help a young boy soon turns into a journey as two families come together in the most unexpected way. The sun was dipping low as Daniel drove home, taking the long way to clear his head after a tough day at school. The road was quiet, the kind of stretch where you could let your thoughts wander. That's what he was doing, half zoning out, half replaying the day in his mind when it happened. A loud screech broke through his thoughts, and up ahead, a car swerved out of control. "Shit," Daniel muttered, gripping the wheel. The small sedan spun, smashed into the guardrail, and stopped at an angle that didn't look right. For a moment, everything was still. Daniel hit his brakes hard, pulling over onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched under his tires as he came to a stop. His heart was already pounding as he jumped out of his car and ran toward the wreck. The front of the car was crumpled, smoke curling up from under the hood. It looked bad. "Hey, are you okay?" he shouted, jogging to the driver's side window. Inside, a woman was slumped forward, her head resting on the wheel. Blood ran down the side of her face from a nasty cut on her forehead. She looked half awake, her eyelids fluttering like she was trying to stay conscious. "Ma'am?" Daniel crouched by the window, knocking lightly. "Can you hear me?" She let out a faint groan, her head tilting toward him. "My leg," she mumbled, her voice shaky. "I can't move it." Daniel glanced down. The steering wheel had jammed against her, pinning her legs. He checked the ground under the car. No flames, no leaking gas, but the smell of something burnt was strong. "Okay, just stay calm. Help's on the way," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking as he dialed. 911, what's your emergency? "I'm on Route 27, near the south turnoff," Daniel said quickly. "There's been a car accident. A woman's trapped inside. Head injury, legs pinned. Car smoking but no fire. Send someone fast." The dispatcher assured him help was on the way, but Daniel didn't feel any better. He crouched again by the window, trying to keep her talking. "What's your name?" She blinked at him, her breath shaky. "Rachel." "Okay, Rachel, I'm Daniel," he said, his voice steady now. "You're going to be fine, I promise. Just keep talking to me. Can you do that?" She nodded weakly but winced as another wave of pain crossed her face. "My son," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dan, he's 10. He's waiting for me." Daniel swallowed hard, her words hitting him in the chest. "We'll take care of him," he said without thinking. "Don't worry about Ben." The faint sound of sirens cut through the quiet, getting louder. Relief washed over Daniel as flashing red and blue lights came into view. He stood and waved the paramedics over. "She's pinned," he explained as they rushed past him. "Head injury. Her legs stuck under the wheel." She mentioned her son Ben. The paramedics moved quickly, cutting her free and stabilizing her on a stretcher. Rachel groaned softly as they worked, her face pale. As they were loading her into the ambulance, she turned her head toward Daniel. "Find him," she whispered. "Please." Before he could respond, the door shut and the ambulance sped away. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the empty road. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know her son. And yet, the way she had looked at him, the fear in her voice, he couldn't just walk away. He let out a slow breath, ran a hand through his hair, and headed back to his car. He didn't know how, but he was going to find Ben. Daniel wasn't exactly sure where to start, but the hospital had given him enough to go on. Rachel's name, her condition, and most importantly, her son's school, Westlake Elementary. So after making sure Rachel was stable at the hospital, Daniel headed there, hoping Ben was still waiting. It was early evening when Daniel pulled into the small parking lot. Most of the kids were gone, the playground empty, except for a boy sitting alone on a bench near the school building. He was hunched over, staring at the ground, his dark curls messy, his backpack slumped at his feet. Daniel got out of his car and walked over slowly, trying not to startle him. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you Ben?" The boy looked up sharply, his face cautious. "Yeah, who are you?" "My name's Daniel," he said, crouching so they were at the same level. "Your mom had a car accident. She's in the hospital, but she's going to be okay. She sent me to find you." Ben's face changed in an instant, his eyes wide with fear. "What? What happened? Is she hurt? Where is she?" His words spilled out fast, his voice rising. "She's okay," Daniel said quickly, holding his hands up to calm him. "The doctors are taking care of her. She just wanted to make sure you weren't left alone." Ben's hands gripped the bench tightly, his knuckles white. "Why didn't she come herself?" Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to say without making things worse. "She's resting," he said finally. "She's got a leg injury, so she can't move around much right now. But she told me to come here to make sure you were okay. She didn't want you to worry." Ben's face twisted, and for a second, Daniel thought he might cry, but the boy just looked down at his feet. "I don't even know you," Ben mumbled. Daniel nodded. "That's fair. Your mom told me to come, but you don't have to trust me right away. Here, look." He pulled out his phone, showing Ben the hospital text message with Rachel's name and his contact info. "See? She wanted me to look after you until she's better. I promise, I'm not here to do anything except help." Ben stared at the screen for a long moment, then back at Daniel. "Where am I supposed to go?" "My place," Daniel said. "I live with my dad. There's a guest room, and it's just for a couple of nights until your mom's ready to come home. I'll call the hospital so you can talk to her later if you want." Ben hesitated, clearly torn. He didn't seem totally convinced, but after a beat, he stood and grabbed his backpack. "Okay," he said quietly. "But can we stop by the lost and found first? I need to get my science kit." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Science kit?" Ben gave a small nod. "It's for my robot project. I left it in the office." "Robot, huh?" Daniel said, standing and motioning for Ben to follow him. "Sounds pretty cool. We'll grab it." They walked to the school office together, where Ben retrieved a shoebox full of wires, small batteries, and what looked like parts of a flashlight. As Ben held it in his hands, Daniel saw the first flicker of a smile cross his face. "Gotta admit," Daniel said as they walked back to the car, "that looks way cooler than anything I ever made when I was your age." Ben glanced at him out of the corner of his eye, clutching the box. "You probably didn't have the right parts," he said, almost defensively. Daniel chuckled. "Fair enough. You might like my dad, then. He's big on science stuff, too." The boy didn't respond, but he seemed a little less guarded as they climbed into Daniel's car. They drove in silence for a while, then watching the trees whip past the window. After a few minutes, Ben asked, "What do you do?" "I'm a teacher," Daniel said. "High school, math, and physics." That got a reaction. Ben turned to look at him, his curiosity piqued. "You're a physics teacher?" "Yep," Daniel said, glancing at him. "Do you like science?" Ben shrugged, but his grip on the kit relaxed a little. "Yeah, I guess I like building stuff." "Well, you're in luck," Daniel said with a small smile. "My dad used to be a teacher too. Retired now, but he still spends half his time building things in the garage. He's going to like you." Ben didn't answer, but he gave Daniel a small, cautious nod. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. When Daniel and Ben pulled up to the house, the porch light was already on, and George was waiting outside. He stood leaning on the railing, his white beard catching the glow of the light, his sharp eyes sizing up the boy as they got out of the car. "Dad," Daniel called as they walked up the steps, Ben clutching his science kit like a shield. "This is Ben. He's going to be staying with us for a little bit." George crouched down slightly, putting his hands on his knees. "Well, hello there, Ben," he said, his voice warm but firm. I'm George. I heard you're a big science guy. Ben blinked, clearly caught off guard. How do you know that? Your hands, George said, pointing to the box Ben was holding. That's not just a regular shoebox, is it? What's in their spare parts? Wires? Some kind of invention? Ben hesitated, but after a second, he opened the box, holding it out slightly like he was showing off a treasure. It's my robot. I'm building it, but it doesn't work yet. George straightened up, his eyes twinkling. A robot, huh? That's impressive. You must have a good head for this kind of thing. Ben shrugged, clearly trying not to look too pleased. Wow, George said, glancing at Daniel. We might just have to fix that. I've got some tools in the garage. Maybe after dinner, we'll see what we can do with it. How's that sound? Ben's eyes widened, and for the first time all night, a small smile crept onto his face. Really? Really, George said with a nod. But only if you eat your dinner first. Science runs on a full stomach, you know. Inside, the house felt warm and lived in. The furniture was old but sturdy, and shelves lined the walls, crammed with books, tools, and little knickknacks that looked like they'd been collected over a lifetime. Ben stared at everything as they walked in, his eyes landing on a model rocket perched on one shelf. You like rockets? George asked, noticing the boy's gaze. Ben nodded slightly, gripping his kit tighter. Good, George said. We'll get along just fine. At dinner, the conversation was light. Daniel and George took turns trying to make Ben feel comfortable. They asked him about school, his favorite subjects, and the kinds of things he liked to build. Mostly robots, Ben mumbled at one point, poking at his mashed potatoes. And sometimes I'd take apart radios. Do you put them back together, or do you just leave the pieces everywhere? George asked with a grin. Ben hesitated, then gave a tiny smirk. Pieces mostly. George laughed. Smart move. Makes it harder for anyone to figure out what went wrong. By the time they cleared the table, Ben seemed less tense, though he was still watching everyone carefully, like he was trying to figure them out. You ready to take a look at that robot? George asked as they stood in the kitchen. Ben's face lit up. Yeah. The garage was packed with shelves of tools and half-finished projects. There were jars of nails and bolts, old radios, and even a model train set that looked like it had been taken apart years ago. George flipped on the overhead light, pulling up a stool for Ben at the workbench. All right, George said, rubbing his hands together. Let's see what you've got. Ben opened his box, spreading out the jumble of wires, a circuit board, a small flashlight bulb, and what looked like part of a motor. George inspected the pieces carefully, nodding every so often. Not bad, he said. What's the problem? It won't move, Ben said, leaning over the table. I think the wires are wrong, but I'm not sure. Good guess, George said, grabbing a soldering iron. Let's test it. Over the next hour, George walked Ben through the process of rewiring the motor. He didn't talk down to him or take over the project. Instead, he guided the boy, letting him figure things out on his own. That's it, George said at one point, pointing to the wire Ben was holding. Now connected there. Yeah, just like that. Perfect. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching as Ben slowly came out of his shell. He wasn't smiling yet, but the boy was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked. Finally, Ben flipped a small switch on the side of the robot. The motor whirred to life, and the little machine twisted forward an inch. Ben's face lit up like a Christmas tree. It works, he shouted, holding the robot up for George to see. Of course it works, George said with a wink. You built it. For the first time since Daniel had met him, Ben laughed, a short, bright sound that filled the garage. That night, as Daniel helped Ben settle into the guest room, the boy clutched his robot tightly in one hand. Your dad's cool, Ben said, quietly. Daniel smiled. Yeah, he is. Ben lay back against the pillow, his eyes already drooping. "Thanks for letting me stay here," he mumbled. "You're welcome, Ben," Daniel said softly. "Get some rest." As Daniel shut the door behind him, he felt a strange mix of emotions, a sense of responsibility he hadn't expected, but also a quiet pride. Ben was still figuring out if he could trust them, but tonight had been a good start. The next morning, after dropping Ben off at school, Daniel decided to check on Rachel. He didn't have to. He could have called the hospital and asked for an update, but something about her last words stuck with him. "Find him," she'd said. He already had, but that wasn't enough. He needed to see her, let her know Ben was okay. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant, but sunlight streamed in through the window, softening the stark whiteness of the walls. Rachel was propped up in bed, her leg in a cast and her face pale but alert. She looked like she'd been through hell but was fighting her way back. When Daniel stepped into the room, she blinked in surprise, then gave him a faint smile. "You found him," she said, her voice scratchy. "I did," Daniel said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "He's fine, a little shaken, but he's doing okay. He's at school now." He paused, then added, "He built a robot last night with my dad." Rachel's brows lifted. "A robot?" "Yeah, my dad's a retired teacher. He loves this kind of stuff. He's already decided Ben's his new apprentice." Rachel let out a soft laugh, wincing a little as she adjusted her position. "That sounds like Ben. He's always tinkering with something. When he was 6, he took apart my toaster to see how it worked. Never got it back together, but he swore he learned a lot." Daniel chuckled. "He's got that spark. You can tell he loves building things." Rachel's smile faded a little as she lowered her gaze. "I've tried to encourage it, but it's hard, you know? Just me and him trying to keep our heads above water most days." Daniel nodded, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. He shifted in his chair, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "You've done a good job, Rachel. Ben's a great kid. Smart, polite. I can tell he's got a good head on his shoulders. That's all you." Her eyes flicked back to him, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. Instead, she swallowed hard and gave him a shaky smile. "Thank you. You didn't have to do all this helping him. Coming here. I don't even know you." "You don't have to," Daniel said simply. "I couldn't just leave you there on the side of the road, and I couldn't leave Ben alone. It's what felt right." Rachel nodded slowly, her fingers picking at the edge of the blanket. Most people would have called 911 and driven away. But you stayed, and now you're taking care of my son. I don't know how to thank you. "You don't need to," Daniel said. "Just focus on getting better. Ben's safe, and he's doing okay. That's what matters." Rachel's hand stilled on the blanket. "He's never had someone like you, a man to look up to." She hesitated, then added softly, "His dad left when Ben was 3. No goodbye, no calls, nothing. It's just been me and Ben ever since." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. "I'm sorry," he said finally. It didn't feel like enough, but it was all he had. Rachel shook her head. "Don't be. We're better off without him, but it's hard sometimes. Ben doesn't say it, but I know he feels it. That hole where his dad should be." Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. "Well," he said carefully, "for what it's worth, Ben seems like a great kid, and he's got you. That's more than enough." Rachel looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I don't know about that," she said quietly, "but thank you." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint beeping of the monitor next to her bed. Finally, Rachel cleared her throat. "How long do they think I'll be here?" "Another week, at least," Daniel said. "The doctors want to make sure your leg is stable before they send you home. But don't worry about Ben. He's fine where he is." Rachel nodded, her fingers tightening on the blanket again. I hate being away from him. He's all I have." "You'll see him soon," Daniel said. "I'll bring him by as soon as the doctors give the okay." Rachel's shoulders relaxed a little, and she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." He nodded, standing up. "I'll check in again soon. You just focus on resting." As he left the room, her voice stopped him at the door. "Daniel?" He turned back. "Yeah? You're a good man," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Ben's lucky to have you right now." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and stepped into the hallway. But her words stayed with him as he walked back to his car. Lucky? He didn't feel lucky. He didn't even feel like he was doing anything extraordinary. But as he thought about Ben and the way the boy's face had lit up when his robot came to life, something inside him stirred. He didn't want to just help for now. He wanted to see this through. Over the next week, Rachel's recovery went better than expected. The bruises on her face were fading, and the hospital staff said she was starting to regain some strength. Daniel checked in on her every couple of days, always bringing updates about Ben. He'd built a second robot, Daniel told her during one visit, leaning back in the uncomfortable hospital chair. "This one spins in circles because, apparently, robots need to dance." Rachel laughed, her first real laugh since the accident. "That sounds like him. And my dad's already talking about building a rocket with him. They're calling it the Backyard Launch Project." Her smile widened. He hasn't stopped talking about rockets since he was 5. He wanted to be an astronaut for a while, then a robot engineer, then a paleontologist. Sometimes all 3. "Sounds like he's got big plans," Daniel said. Rachel nodded, her face softening. "He always does. He's got this spark, you know? I want to keep it alive for him. I don't want him to lose that." "He won't," Daniel said firmly. "Not with a mom like you." Rachel's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "I don't know about that. I've been doing my best, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough. I mean, I work so much just to keep us afloat, and he ends up spending more time tinkering in his room than with other kids. I worry he's lonely." Daniel hesitated. He hadn't known Rachel for long, but he could already tell how much she loved Ben, how much she carried on her shoulders for his sake. "I don't think he feels lonely," he said carefully. "Not the way you think. He's got you. And you've built a life for him where he can dream big. That's not nothing, Rachel. That's everything." Her eyes shimmered, and she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her blanket. "You don't even know us," she said softly, but there was no edge in her tone. Daniel shrugged. "I know enough." That weekend, Rachel was cleared for a brief visit to Daniel's house. She still needed a wheelchair to get around, but that didn't matter to Ben, who nearly knocked her over with the force of his hug when she arrived. "Mom!" he yelled, throwing his arms around her. "Guess what? Grandpa George says we're going to launch a rocket next week." "Grandpa George?" Rachel asked, laughing as she hugged him back. Ben grinned. "That's what I call him now. He doesn't mind." Rachel looked up at George, who was leaning against the porch, railing with a grin of his own. "Not at all," George said with a shrug. "I think it suits me." Ben dragged her inside to show her everything he'd been working on. The house, though modest, had become a second home for him in just a week. His science kit was spread across the dining table, his robot parked next to a half-built model rocket. "You've been busy," Rachel said, her voice full of warmth. "Look at this." Ben held up a drawing of the rocket, complete with little stick figures labeled me, Mom, Daniel, and Grandpa George. Daniel glanced over Rachel's shoulder, smiling at the sketch. "Guess we're all part of the mission now," he said. Rachel looked at him, something unspoken passing between them. Later that evening, after Ben had gone to bed, Rachel sat on the porch with Daniel and George. The cool night air was refreshing, and the stars were out in full force. George had gone inside for a refill on his tea, leaving Rachel and Daniel alone. "This place," Rachel said quietly, looking out at the yard. It feels like, I don't know, like home. Daniel turned toward her, leaning back against the railing. That's what we were going for. Rachel smiled, her hands resting on the arms of her wheelchair. It's been a long time since I felt that. Like we really belong somewhere. You do, Daniel said simply. She didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. You've done so much for us, she said finally. More than I can ever repay. And not just for Ben, for me too. You don't have to repay me, Daniel said, his tone light but honest. You and Ben are good for this place. You've brought life back into it. Rachel looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. Sometimes I think about how different things could have been if you hadn't stopped that day, if you hadn't cared enough to stick around. Don't think like that, Daniel said. You don't have to do this alone anymore, Rachel. You've got people now. We're here. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then she turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. Over the next few weeks, Rachel continued to visit on weekends, slowly building her strength back. She would sit on the porch or at the kitchen table, watching Ben and George argue over which wires to use for their projects, while Daniel occasionally stepped in to referee. By the time Rachel was able to walk again, it was clear. She and Ben weren't just guests anymore. They were part of the family. By the time winter rolled around, Rachel and Ben were spending most of their days at Daniel and George's house. It wasn't official, but nobody really talked about it. Ben had practically claimed the corner of the garage for his science projects, and Rachel had started helping out in small ways, chopping vegetables for dinner, folding the occasional load of laundry. It all just fit. One Saturday morning, Rachel arrived in the backyard on crutches, still recovering, but determined to get around on her own. Ben ran up to her, beaming. Mom, you're just in time. We're launching the rocket today. Rachel laughed as he tugged her toward the makeshift launch pad in the middle of the yard. This is the rocket you've been working on for weeks, right? The one you said was going to break the sound barrier? Ben grinned. Yeah, but Grandpa George says we have to manage expectations. He air-quoted the phrase dramatically. George, crouching by the rocket with a checklist in hand, glanced up. I said that so you wouldn't get mad if it just wobbles and falls over. It won't, Ben declared. It's perfect. Daniel walked over, holding a small toolkit. Safety goggles, everyone. Especially you, Mom, he teased, handing Rachel a pair. She rolled her eyes but took them. What do I do? Cheer when it doesn't blow up, Daniel said, giving her a wink. Rachel shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. Jill shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. The countdown started. 5, 4, 3, 2. Ben pressed the button with all the enthusiasm in the world. With a loud whoosh, the rocket shot into the air, climbing higher and higher before its parachute popped open and it drifted back down. Ben threw his hands in the air. It worked. Did you see that? Rachel clapped, laughing as he ran to retrieve the rocket. That was amazing, Ben. George nodded approvingly. Not bad, kid. You're a natural. Daniel snapped a picture of Rachel as she watched Ben, her smile wide and her eyes full of pride. Later, when he looked at the photo again, it struck him just how different she looked now, stronger, lighter, like she'd let go of some invisible weight she'd been carrying. That evening, they gathered around the dining table, eating bowls of George's famous and slightly overspiced chili. Ben was in the middle of explaining how he wanted to add a camera to the next rocket when George interrupted. Just don't aim it at the neighbors. I'm not explaining that to Mr. Simmons again. Ben burst out laughing, and Daniel joined in, shaking his head. Rachel smiled as she watched the scene, her heart swelling. You're awfully quiet, Daniel said, glancing at her. Everything okay? She nodded, resting her chin on her hand. I was just thinking about how normal this feels. I didn't realize how much I missed that. Just sitting around a table, talking, laughing, it's nice. You belong here, you know, George said simply, not looking up from his chili. Rachel blinked, clearly caught off guard. Thank you, she said, her voice softer now. You do, Daniel added, his tone just as casual but carrying something deeper. Both of you. It's like you've always been part of the team. Rachel didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at her bowl, her fingers tracing the edge of the spoon. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. You've done so much for us, more than I can ever repay. I don't even know how to thank you. You already have, Daniel said. You brought Ben, and now we've got rocket launches in the backyard. That's more than enough. Rachel smiled, her cheeks warming. Later that night, after Ben had gone to bed, Rachel and Daniel found themselves sitting by the fireplace. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering orange glow of the flames. George had gone to bed hours ago, leaving the two of them alone. You've been quiet tonight, Daniel said, echoing his earlier words. Rachel glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I guess I've just been thinking about how different things feel now. How different I feel. Daniel set his mug down, leaning forward slightly. Different good or different bad? Good, she said quickly. Really good. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You've given us something I didn't think we'd ever have, a place where we belong. A place where Ben can be happy, and where I can breathe again. Daniel's eyes softened, and for a moment, they just sat there in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them. You've brought just as much to this place, you know, Daniel said finally. It was too quiet before you and Ben showed up. Now it feels alive again. Rachel met his gaze, something unspoken lingering in the air. Daniel, I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped that day, she said, her voice low. If you hadn't been there for us? She trailed off, shaking her head like she couldn't quite put it into words. Daniel reached over, resting his hand lightly over hers. You don't have to think about that. We found each other when we needed to, and that's what matters. Rachel looked down at their hands, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For everything? It was a crisp winter evening, the kind where the air feels sharp and the stars seem closer somehow. Inside the house, things were anything but still. George and Ben were in the living room, hovering over the model solar system they'd been assembling for days. Ben held up a glue stick like it was the most important tool in the world, explaining why Jupiter needed extra reinforcement. Rachel and Daniel sat in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Rachel wiped down the counter while Daniel stacked plates in the dishwasher. It was a simple, quiet moment, but the air between them felt different. You've been quiet, Rachel said, glancing at him over her shoulder. Daniel paused, leaning on the counter. You've said that a lot lately. Because it's true, she shot back, smirking. Something's on your mind. Spill it. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. I've just been thinking about how much has changed since that day. Rachel stopped what she was doing, giving him her full attention. Changed how? Daniel shrugged, looking down at the counter. I was just living my life, you know? Teaching, taking care of my dad, going through the motions. And then you and Ben showed up, and now... He looked up at her, his expression soft but serious. Now it feels like my life actually means something. Like I'm part of something bigger than just... Rachel didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her heart twisting in a way she hadn't felt in years. I don't think I realized how lonely I was until you both showed up, he added. Rachel set down the cloth she was holding and stepped closer to him, her hands resting lightly on the counter. You're not the only one, she said softly. Daniel's gaze flicked to hers, searching her face. Rachel, I know this might sound crazy, but I care about you. And Ben, more than I ever expected to. You're not just staying here anymore. You're part of my life now. Both of you." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long keeping her guard up, trying to be strong for Ben, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to lean on someone else. But here was Daniel, standing in front of her, asking for nothing and offering everything. "Daniel." She started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know how I feel. That's all." Rachel's lips curved into a soft smile as she stepped even closer. "I think I've felt the same way for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it." Daniel's eyes lit up, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Yeah?" "Yeah," she said, her voice steady now. "You've done so much for us, Daniel. More than I ever thought anyone would. But it's not just that. It's you. You make us feel safe, and you make me feel like maybe I don't have to do this all on my own anymore." Daniel smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't. You never did. You've got us now." She squeezed his hand, her heart pounding in a way that wasn't scary for once. "So, what now?" Daniel chuckled softly. "I don't know. I didn't think this far ahead." Rachel laughed, shaking her head. "You're terrible at planning." "Hey, I'm a big picture guy," he said with a grin. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence, and as they stood there, inches apart, Daniel leaned forward slightly, giving her time to pull back. When she didn't, he closed the distance, brushing his lips softly against hers. The kiss was warm and gentle, full of promise. When they pulled apart, Rachel felt like the world had shifted somehow, like everything had clicked into place. "Okay," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "So that's what now?" Daniel grinned. "Yeah, that's what now." Later that night, Rachel sat by the fire, a blanket draped over her lap, watching Ben and George add the finishing touches to their solar system. Daniel walked over and sat beside her, handing her a mug of tea. Ben turned around, holding up the model triumphantly. "It's done! Finally," George teased, shaking his head. "I thought we'd never finish this thing." "Hey, it's not science if it's easy," Ben said proudly. Rachel smiled, her heart full as she watched her son. She glanced at Daniel, who was leaning back in his chair, watching the same scene with quiet contentment. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded. "More than okay." Rachel leaned her head against his shoulder, letting herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. She didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. Spring arrived, bringing warm breezes and a garden full of blooming flowers. It was the perfect day for a wedding, a small, intimate ceremony in the backyard of the house that had become a home. Ben darted around the yard, adjusting the folding chairs and double-checking every detail like a man on a mission. "Ben," Daniel called from the porch, struggling to knot his tie. "It's fine. Everything looks great." "No, it has to be perfect," Ben said, rushing over to straighten one of the strings of lights hanging between the trees. "Mom deserves perfect." Daniel smiled at the boy's determination. "She's going to think it's perfect no matter what. Trust me." Ben paused, then nodded. "Okay, but are you going to fix your tie, or should I ask Grandpa George to do it?" "Funny," Daniel said, smirking as George walked out from the house with a cup of coffee. "Very funny." Inside the house, Rachel stood in front of a small mirror in the guest room, smoothing down the soft, white dress she wore. It wasn't fancy, but it suited her simple and elegant. Her hair was pinned back, with a few loose curls framing her face. For the first time in years, she felt light, like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders anymore. "You look beautiful," George said, stepping into the room. He held out a small box. "Ben wanted you to have this." Rachel opened the box, revealing a delicate necklace with a tiny rocket charm. Her throat tightened as she held it up. "He said it's because you're the one who gave him the courage to dream big," George said softly. Rachel smiled, her eyes misty. "He's a good kid." "He is," George agreed. "And you're a good mom. You've done so much for him. Now let Daniel do a little for you." Rachel chuckled, wiping at her eyes. "You sound like you're trying to marry me off." "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," George said with a grin. "Now come on. Your boy's about to explode with excitement out there." The ceremony was simple and full of laughter. Rachel walked down the makeshift aisle with Ben proudly holding her hand, his chest puffed up like he was escorting royalty. Daniel stood under the flower-covered arch, his tie finally straightened, his eyes locked on Rachel as she approached. When they reached him, Ben stepped to the side but didn't let go of Rachel's hand right away. He looked up at Daniel, his face serious. "Take care of her, okay?" Daniel crouched slightly so they were at eye level. "I promise." Ben nodded, satisfied, and stepped back to stand beside George. The officiant kept things short, which was good because Ben could barely contain himself. When Daniel and Rachel exchanged vows, his grin threatened to split his face in two. Daniel spoke of second chances and how Rachel and Ben had brought life back into his world. Rachel promised to build a future with him, one full of love, laughter, and the family they were creating together. When they were finally pronounced husband and wife, Ben let out the loudest cheer, clapping so hard that George had to calm him down. The reception was just as lively. It wasn't much, just a small dinner in the yard with a handful of close friends and neighbors, but it felt right. Ben showed off his solar system model to anyone who would listen, while George told stories that made everyone laugh. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Rachel found a quiet moment under the twinkling string lights. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, as they watched Ben chase fireflies with a few of the neighborhood kids. "This feels like a dream," Rachel said softly. "It's real," Daniel replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And it's just the beginning." She smiled, tilting her head to look up at him. "You know what Ben said to me earlier? He said he feels like this is what he always imagined a family would be like." Daniel's chest tightened, warmth spreading through him. "He's a smart kid." "Yeah," Rachel agreed. "And he's got a pretty great dad now." Daniel froze, the word dad hitting him square in the chest. "You think he feels that way?" Rachel nodded. "I know he does." Later that night, after most of the guests had gone home, Daniel found Ben sitting on a blanket in the yard, staring up at the stars through his telescope. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, sitting down beside him. "What are you looking at?" Ben adjusted the telescope slightly. "Just thinking about what it'd be like to go up there someday." Daniel smiled. "Big dreams, huh?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, Mom says I got that from her." "She's not wrong," Daniel said. Ben was quiet for a moment, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. Then he looked up at Daniel, his voice soft. "Can I call you Dad?" Daniel blinked, the words catching him off guard. His throat tightened as he smiled. "Yeah, Ben, I'd like that a lot." Ben grinned and went back to his telescope like it was no big deal. But for Daniel, it was everything. Inside the house, Rachel watched the two of them from the window, her heart full. George came up behind her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "They're good for each other," George said, handing her a mug. "They are," Rachel agreed. She glanced back at George, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "You're not going to get all sentimental on me, are you?" George raised an eyebrow. "Please." "I leave the mushy stuff to Daniel." Rachel laughed, shaking her head. "Fair enough." That night, as the house grew quiet and the stars shone brightly overhead, the family, because that's what they were now, settled into their new normal. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was everything they needed.